Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I think we're still in Sydney, wherever it is we are, but this is a beautiful room. And it's always fun to talk to creative people. It's the only opportunity I ever have to talk to an audience or an industry that has no ego, where everybody's working on the same team, pulling together and rooting each other on. So it's a lot of fun to be here. You may have noticed already, just in 30 seconds, I don't know if I'm a shaker, but I'm a mover, and I hope that won't drive anybody crazy. So I want to talk about trends, fads, and transformation. What's temporary as we look around us at the change that's coming from digital, and what's permanent, or what seems to be permanent at this moment. And before I do that, I just want to take about 2 minutes for anyone who may not be familiar with the work I do, sharing a little bit of what I do so that you can tell where my data, my insights come from. And then I want to share some of those insights, particularly as we look at teenagers and young people. So let me start by saying I'm an old television guy. I've spent most of my life in and around the world of television, the most powerful medium ever invented. And in the work I did in television, I was always taught that we blew it where television was concerned. We lost a great opportunity. And what I mean by that is television, if you think about it, is the only mass medium we knew ahead of time was going to be a mass medium. There was no question that radio listeners were going to embrace radio with pictures. So what I was taught that we should have done but didn't do is we should have tracked people before they had television and gone back to them year after year as they acquired and used it to see how it changed their lives. Simple questions like when we were watching 3 hours of television a day and we asked people where'd those 3 hours come from? What were they doing less of? They didn't know. We just grabbed that time out of the air. We could have learned if the time for television came from talking as a family, reading books or newspapers, sleep, or from some other place. And I became convinced in the 90s that the impact of digital technology, first the web and now mobile, was going to be far more powerful than television. Everybody has their own example of when they realized the internet was going to change the world. Mine came in 1998 working with the American broadcast networks who showed me research that showed beginning in '98, for the first time in the history of at least American television, kids under the age of 14 were starting to watch less television. First time they had ever been drawn away from television, and the explanation was singularly computers and the web. So this spoke to me in hugely powerful terms. If this technology could draw kids away from television, the most powerful medium ever invented, then something hugely important was going on. So believing that we lost a great opportunity with television and that the impact of digital was going to be even more powerful than television, 11 years ago we started this massive project, this tracking of digital that we thought should have been conducted of television starting in the 40s. And we started in the US, we've gone back to the same people 11 years in a row. We've watched as non-users move to dial-up, as dial-up users migrate to broadband, and we saw almost immediately broadband changed everything, not for the reason most people think, not because of the speed, but it's the always on, the direct connection that changes the whole relationship to the web, has led to it becoming our most important source of information, surpassing all other media. We watch as about 2% excuse me, drop off the web each year, and we want to know who are these people who leave and why, and more importantly, do they return, and if so, when and what brings them back. And then 10 years in, we track the never users. We started our work in the US. We're now in about 35 countries around the world. We're throughout Asia, Latin America, Europe. We are proud to have a great partner, Swinburne in Australia, who's been with us for the last 7 years. And we're even in some unusual places like Iran. So that's what I want to draw from, this tracking over the last 11 years, and look at some of the trends we're seeing. But what I learned 2 or 3 years into our work was we were seeing all kinds of new behaviors coming from people between the ages of 12 and 24. Now, I spend a lot of time with teenagers. I have tremendous respect for teenagers. I love teenagers in every way that's appropriate. And as we looked at their behavior, we wanted to know which things do they do because they're young and have time. Although sadly, they don't realize how much time they have until they get older and no longer have that time. But which things do they do because they're young and have time and they will abandon as they get older and pesky things get in their way, like jobs, spouses, and children? And which things do they do that are truly transformational, that they will take with them the rest of their lives and all those that will follow will take with them? What's a trend or a fad, and what's really transformation? Now, one of the things we saw was that even though we were studying teenagers, incidentally, you've already figured out, my PowerPoints are worthless. They're not, and I don't like PowerPoint. They're just designed to be topic headings. It's supposed to all come from here. So, and I'd rather you listening to me than reading those, and there's nothing to read, so you have no choice. But anyway, even though we're talking about teenagers, one of the things we found was one of the most interesting environments to study were college students who graduated and moved into their apartments and set up their households for the first time. And the way they had to make choices, which things they did growing up from their parents and in their dorm rooms, if they lived away at school, do they then establish in their own households, and which things do they do differently? And 11 years ago, for example, we saw that almost nobody was moving into their own households setting up a landline phone. It became very obvious where the future of landline phones rest, and of course we know what's happened. We saw they didn't subscribe to newspapers, and I'll talk about that in a minute or two, and we knew that newspapers over the long haul were in trouble. In the last 3 years, we've seen something also pretty interesting that's very worrisome for a lot of media operators. We're finding that they're moving into apartments and not subscribing to cable or satellite television. In America, where 90% of us get our television through cable or satellite, that's a pretty profound trend. Australia, those numbers, free to air, is much more healthy here. But we were finding that the cable companies are fighting back. We have an initiative called TV Everywhere, where the cable companies are saying, you want to watch television on your mobile phone, on your computer, on your iPad, on your television set. We don't care where you want to watch it. You can watch it anywhere you want once you authenticate to us that you're a cable subscriber and spend $70 a month. And what they didn't understand was one of the very reasons they weren't subscribing to cable or satellite was to avoid those $70 a month. I don't think we're looking at the end or the beginning of the end of cable or satellite. I do think we're looking at the beginning of the end of cable and satellite priced the way it is now. And we're going to see all kinds of different alternatives. But what I want to do with the rest of my time is look at these behaviors, as I said, that we think teenagers will abandon, and then look at those behaviors that we think are permanent and they will take with them. So let's start with some of the ones they'll abandon. Teenagers think they're not affected by advertising or brand. They think they're too shrewd, too smart, too cynical to be affected by advertising messages. Of course, nothing could be further from the truth. I think it's charming that they believe they're immune to those messages, but if you want to see how affected a teenager you know is by brand or advertising, try giving him or her as a gift an MP3 player that is not an iPod, and then duck quickly as they throw it back at you. Of course they're affected by brand. They don't realize that. We know that almost everything we do is affected in some way by brand or advertising, but they think they're above it. And I say that with respect. I like the fact that they don't think they're affected, but they quickly abandon that as they get into their 20s or later. They think that unknown peers are just like them and can be trusted. One of the most worrisome trends we see among teenagers. They think the people they meet on Facebook, or formerly on MySpace, although no one's on MySpace anymore, but they think the people they meet online and social networking are just like them. And to the degree that an unknown peer really is a peer, they may be able to be trusted. But we've also come to learn, and they come to learn later, that unknown peers can also be predators, can be scammers, can be even worse. And fortunately, that's a trend they seem to move beyond. We know that teenagers who are online, or we know that for those of us who are not teenagers, who are online sending email and think we're hip and cool, to today's teenagers, email is something their parents do. Old people send email. We know they are communicating through IMing, through texting, through social networking, and very few of them even check email accounts, although I always wonder why they bother to have them if they don't check them. But they really view that as an old-fashioned way of communicating. As I'm sure you're starting to see, they also view voice not only as antiquated, they view voice as an intrusion, that it's rude to just call somebody unannounced on your phone and start talking to them. That's fortunately a behavior also that seems to change as they get older. We know when Twitter came along, most of us were asking, who cares what you had for lunch yesterday, which video you rented last night. Now, I came to realize that Twitter was a lot more than that a long time ago. When the first reports of terrorism from Mumbai came via Twitter, when stories of plane crashes, Twitter was becoming a very important news medium. Now Twitter has become an essential customer service tool and a way that brands reach out to their customers. So Twitter's a lot more than what you had for lunch yesterday. But one of the things that I didn't understand at first, and really spent some time to understand, is do they really believe that people care what they had for lunch yesterday? Do they think people really care that they were in a good mood or a bad mood when they woke up? And what I found is not only do they think people care, but it's not a self-centeredness. It's not a narcissism. They actually care about those things of their friends as well. It's not just that they think people want to know about them. One of the people I work with, one of the teenagers we were talking to, explained this the best definition. One of the reasons I have so much respect for talking to people who do this. One of the best definitions of why Twitter works. And was explaining, we don't watch and monitor and pay attention to everything we see. It gives us an ambient awareness, a general understanding of the environment and what people are doing, and we plug in when it makes sense to you. We know user-generated content exploded from nowhere in 2001, 2002. What we've seen talking to young people is, to paraphrase Andy Warhol, they couldn't care less about 15 minutes of fame. What they're interested in is 15 megabytes of fame. Because 15 minutes of fame is gone in 15 minutes. But 15 megabytes can last forever. That can have some consequences as well. But tremendous, really the barriers between user-generated and professional content broke down a long time ago. Then we saw something really interesting. We saw in America, and I think Australians are pretty close to us in this way. There are a lot of key differences as well. We saw that most Americans weren't very good at distinguishing good information from bad. Because by and large, we could trust our mass media the same way I think you could trust your mass media. I see one of your sponsors is Fairfax, and of course you can trust anything they ever tell you. But no, your mass media is of high quality. So because we and you basically trusted our mass media, we never developed very good critical media skills. We generally don't look at media and say, where's that coming from? What's their agenda? Can I believe them? And we took that trust. Incidentally, our partners in China find the Chinese are much better at critical media skills than we are, not because they're smarter than we are, but because they've never been able to trust their media. They've always had to look at it with a critical eye. So we took our faith in the media to the internet and got badly burned. All of a sudden, we were looking at websites that looked reputable, and the information could be scurrilous or worthless. And what we've seen is slowly people start developing those skills. People start understanding the differences between amateur and professional. One of the most hopeful signs we're seeing in America is that teenagers who've never read the New York Times are now starting to read the NewYorkTimes.com because it's shorthand for quality and reliability. So user-generated content will continue to have a role in our lives forever, but we're beginning to understand its limitations and some of the places we can put it. And of course, if you're a blogger, as much as you love the blogosphere, what's your goal? To get out of the blogosphere as quickly as possible and become a professional reporter or professional writer. Communities. I think you know well that social networking is at the center of everything. We saw 7 years ago that it was the first thing that was causing people to log onto the web more than to check their email. Some of you may know a fight I got into because it happened in Australia. It was about 6 years ago, just after Rupert Murdoch had bought MySpace for $580 million. And Murdoch bought MySpace because he said it was one of the only ways to reach young people. They weren't watching television anymore, they weren't reading newspapers or magazines as much, so MySpace was the way to reach them. And he bought MySpace just before we had released our 5th year's report. And I was talking to some reporters here in Sydney. They were asking a bunch of questions about our report. And then the last question was, what do you think about Murdoch buying MySpace? And I had said, and got a lot of coverage for this, I wasn't looking for it, but got it, because you guys pay a lot of attention to Murdoch, for good reason. What I said was, it's a great investment. That part of the quote got lost forever. But he'll never be able to hang on to the teenage users of MySpace. And News Corp, or here News Limited, got very angry. And they fought back, not by saying I was wrong, but by saying, look at how much money we're making. And they were right. They made tons of money from MySpace. They paid $580 million. Almost immediately, they signed a $900 million ad share deal with Google. They brilliantly marketed their Fox films and television shows. It was a great investment, particularly when you consider that 2.5 years ago, AOL bought Bebo, a social network some of you know, for $850 million, and sold it last summer for $5 million. That's the old joke. How do you make $5 million fast? You buy something for $850 million. But it turns out we were right. They weren't able to hang on to the teenagers. We had seen this because we had watched the rise and fall of GeoCities and the rise and fall of Friendster, and we knew, and this is where we got a lot of coverage, we knew that to a teenager, an online community was like a nightclub, which is what I had said. And when the nightclub becomes too popular or the uncool kids start showing up at the nightclub, you're out of there. Because the cost of going from one club to another is nil. And what's the worst thing that can happen to you as a teenager in a nightclub? Your mother walks in. Well, now on Friendster, your mother wants to friend you. How long are you going to hang around a place your mother's hanging around? So we know that teenagers, it is a trend or a fad which community they're in, but the heaviest users of social networking are people in their 60s and 70s, and they're the ones who derive the most value out of it. And this has become the way you communicate. In the work I do with brands, and it's not just me, it's everybody, the question on every brand's mind the last 3 years, now it's largely being answered, should we communicate with our customers through social networks? And to me, that's the simplest question there is to answer. Of course you have to be there and communicate with them. They're going to talk about you whether you're there or not. You may as well be there and guide the conversation at times, but they're afraid people are going to say mean and ugly things about them, and they will. And one of the interesting things we've seen is that when people do say mean or ugly things about your brand online, more often than not, your other customers will defend you or explain. And sometimes, if you're British Petroleum or you're Toyota, and people say mean and ugly things about you, you deserve them, and you just have to step back and say, we understand, and we're going to do better. But social networking has become simply the only way, really reliably, to communicate with an entire generation, we think at this point. And even Google, one of your sponsors, and I'm a great lover of Google and speak at their Zeitgeist event almost every year. And for the last 4 years, going to Google events, you would always see all the agencies, all the creatives very nervous about Google, wondering what's Google's plans? Are they going to they trying to take over their business? But it was interesting. At the last Zeitgeist, it was the first time I saw Google themselves actually become nervous. Not terrified, just nervous, because they're looking at an entire internet experience on Facebook that doesn't involve Google, that they can't search, and wondering what Google now themselves wondering what everybody else had been wondering about Google, what's their place, what's their role in this new universe? And on privacy, I always thought, and it turns out I was misquoting, I always thought it was Vint Cerf who said there is no privacy. Get over it. And I was on a panel with Vint a couple months ago, and he said, no, that was Scott McNealy of Sun Microsystems. But teenagers, you know, it's interesting. In the society we live in, you can't sign a contract until you're 18 years old. That's a pretty good law. It's the idea that you shouldn't be able to be bound by something until you're old enough to understand the consequences of what you're doing. And yet we're seeing 11 and 12-year-olds put things on social networks that may be far more damaging than the contracts they can sign, that their employers, the colleges they apply to, and eventually their children may look at. But generally, we do see this completely freewheeling attitude towards privacy. I have nothing to hide. I don't care what people see. Although parents are learning, just you like me as a child, our parents would take us aside and say, look both ways before crossing. Don't get in a car with a stranger. Now parents have to add 4 or 5 new warnings, all of which have to do with being online. Don't trust that people are who they say they are. Don't post anything that you wouldn't want on the front page of the newspaper, and all those other rules. But the interesting question that a lot of us have been tracking, is this a lifelong change in their attitude towards privacy? And the best evidence we have now is no. As they get older and they have secrets and things and misdeeds they want to protect, the old attitudes towards privacy seem to be coming back. And then to look at the behaviors they keep forever. Total control over media. They want to move their content freely from platform to platform, irrespective of anyone's desire to restrict them. The more we try to restrict them, the more they'll move it just to show us they can move it. It was 3.5 years ago the first iPhone came out. And when it first came out, it was only available legally in America on AT&T. And there was a 17-year-old kid who became the first person to unlock the iPhone. Steve Jobs didn't want it unlocked. And it took him about 1.5 months to unlock it. He was interviewed by the media. He was demonstrating his unlocked iPhone. The case was off. Wires were dangling. Solder was falling out of it. And he admitted he didn't even want an unlocked iPhone. He just wanted to stick it to Steve Jobs and show Jobs that you couldn't lock it on him. And that's what we're talking about, a generation that will do things just to show us they can do it. We're also seeing, as they move from platform to platform and start television on a set and move it to a computer and then finish it on a mobile, we're seeing the beginning of the end of platforms. We think teenagers will print out 15 photographs in their lifetime. They'll print out 4 or 5 for their parents. That will disappear when they become parents. They'll print out 4 or 5 for their wallet. That's disappearing as their smartphone becomes their wallet. And they'll print out a couple for their desk or wall, which will disappear as we use electronic photo frames. But for them, photos, the internet is not the place you send photos, which is what most of us were using it for. It's where photographs live. Teenagers turn against newspapers, partially because of environmental waste. We know at its peak, our New York Times was printing 200 million pieces of paper a day, except on Sunday when it printed 2 billion pieces of paper, and then hired thousands of trucks using gasoline, spewing carbon into the air to deliver them. Teenagers were turning to their parents saying, how can you read the newspaper? Don't you care about the future of the earth? And CDs and DVDs, we think, will be gone in 3 to 4 years. We've already watched the wrapping of CDs shrink, but the concept of owning media is in its last legs. It clearly is moving to the cloud where you will have access. These are interesting pricing issues. I think there'll be subscriptions to every piece of music ever made, to every movie ever made, and maybe to every newspaper and magazine published as well. Talking about the future of newspapers for just a minute, we know that 30 years ago, teenagers used to read newspapers. 30 years ago, teenagers didn't read newspapers. Sorry, 30 years ago, they didn't read newspapers, but started to when they got into their 20s and 30s. We know today they don't read newspapers, and the evidence is clear. They never will. A lot of people look at that and say, well, they just don't care about news. All they care about is what's happening on Facebook or Twitter. Nothing could be further from the truth. Teenagers around the world today more interested in news than any teenage generation in the last 70 years. They're just not going to the paper, they're going online. In every country in the world we are in, when internet penetration gets to 30%, offline newspaper sales begin to decline. The sad truth for newspapers, and there's no way around this, just the papers, is every time a newspaper reader dies, they're not being replaced by a new reader. We saw this 11 years ago. I went to the American Society of Newspaper Editors in Washington in the year 2000, and I said to them, every time one of your readers dies, they're not being replaced by a new reader. You have 25 to 30 years left. They called me dangerous. They called me an alarmist. They called me every name they could think of, except the one that turns out I actually was, which was not correct. I was wrong by a mile. I was an optimist. Because if I was right 10 years ago that they had 25 to 30 years left, today they would have 15 to 20. In America, they have less than 5. I think in Australia, 8, 9, somewhere in that level. One of the fun things we discovered, I think most of you know this, we discovered 8 years ago teenagers weren't wearing watches. And we were wondering, as was the entire jewelry industry, not to mention the economy of Switzerland, wondering the answer to the question, will they start wearing watches as they get older? Well, we've been tracking people for 11 years. We have people who are 30 who were 19 and 25 who were 14. So far, the evidence is still clear. They're not wearing watches. That will never affect Rolex, because people don't spend $5,000 for a watch because it tells better time. They spend $5,000 because it sends a message to other people or makes them feel better. But inexpensive watches, there may be a real problem with watches in the future. They are just not wearing them. We know that 80% of teenagers, however, sleep within arm's length of their mobile phones and use their mobile phones as their alarm clocks as well. So it may not just be watches, it may be alarm clocks. Television, we know if you talk to a younger person about the days you used to watch television when a broadcast network told you to watch television, you're going to sound to them the way our great-great-grandparents would have sounded to us talking about horses and buggies. Television simply does not mean a set in the home on a schedule. It means video. YouTube is as much television as 9 or the ABC. Television is video you watch everywhere and anywhere, and you watch it on your schedule. Game playing, for those of us who look at game playing and think it's nothing more than frittering away time, or that gamers are serial killers in training, gaming is becoming a very serious and big business. And more than that, employers are starting to realize that gamers have incredible abilities to work together on task-oriented jobs, that they can cooperate, that gaming is turning out to be a really powerful predictor in many industries of success. And mobile, I just came last week from Barcelona and the World Mobile Congress. It's hard for an American to talk about mobile because America's a third world country where mobile's concerned, where the rest of the world using their mobile phones underground in subways, paying for Cokes out of machines in Sweden. In Israel, you can be 6 blocks away from your car and replenish your parking meter with your mobile phone. We in America can barely get our mobile phones to work above ground for voice communication. But mobile is not just becoming the center of younger people's lives, it's becoming the only part where telecommunications is concerned. We saw the IDC released a report about 3 weeks ago that showed that last year smartphone sales had surpassed PC sales. We believe, and when the iPad came out, one of the first questions I wanted to answer is the iPad the 4th screen, or does it replace the 2nd screen? I now firmly believe it replaces the 2nd screen for most of us, the computer screen. Our work shows that only 4 to 6% of people who own PCs actually need PCs. Computer-assisted designers, number crunchers, heavy-duty writers. For the rest of us, we don't need an operating system that takes 3 minutes to boot and frequently crashes. Your mobile phone, or even better, your iPad, you turn it on, and what a remarkable concept. 2 seconds later, you're using it. We think we're beginning to see the beginning of the end for many of us, not all of us, of PCs. And we think as India's 16% internet penetration climbs to 30, 40, and 50%, it's not going to be with PCs on the desk. And lastly, the most important, lasting, continuing, we think really transformation to come from the web is empowerment. Empowerment in a lot of ways. Empowerment with regard to journalism, that they read or we read a story and we immediately contact the journalist and tell him or her how they got it right, or more often than not, how they got it wrong. We contribute to the story. We're not just passive readers anymore. In medicine, the days of you have an itch, a scratch, or a problem, and you go see the doctor, and he or she tells you what's wrong with you and gives you medicine. Today, there's no one with the most minor of symptoms who doesn't look it up on the internet, look at the different possibilities, look at the different ways of treating it. They walk in to see the doctor. They want to be a member of the treatment team and discuss the alternatives. Sadly, the doctor wishes you would just shut up and take your medicine. But whether doctors like it or not, that's changed. In the sales process, the old way of buying cars, you walked into the dealer, you negotiated down from the sticker price, you'd get to an impasse, the salesperson would have to consult the mysterious sales manager in the back room, like the Wizard of Oz behind the curtain. Those days are gone. You go in with the wholesale price. You both know that you have the wholesale price. The negotiation quickly gets to a price you can live with, or you leave. Even, and this is my favorite example, even the entire funeral business has changed because of the internet. Just very, very briefly, funeral business that take, and I hope I'm not offending anybody whose family works in this business, and I mean that, it's very honorable business, but the funeral business is a business that takes advantage of people in time of need. You're led to believe that how much money you spend is a reflection of how much you love somebody. And when a loved one dies, the last thing you're going to do is go to 5 funeral homes, get prices, and then go back to the first one and say, well, these guys will do it for this. So because of that, frequently you're led to buy services that you're told you have to or are appropriate to buy. You don't know what they should cost. And that's what the internet is best at, shining light into dark places. Now there are websites that tell you what's legally required, how much it should cost, where you should go. And you can now, I don't know if you can do this, I know in Australia, I know you have Costco here. I don't know if you can go onto Costco.com in Australia. I assume you can, but I guarantee you, go onto Costco.com in America and you can buy a casket online at about an 80% discount. And the last thing you want is a casket delivered to your house 10 days from now. But they deliver it overnight to a funeral home. And of course, funeral homes are now saying that's unsanitary, it's illegal because they don't like it at all. They're even, one of the weird things, you can buy your casket now and use it 10 years from now, but why anybody would want to look at their casket? Anyway, So empowerment, this power we're gaining over government officials, the power, this remarkable power we have seen and continue to see today in Libya, this power we're gaining over repression, although I don't want to be Pollyanna-ish, these same tools that really give us power and organize are used in places like Iran to identify dissidents and to snuff them out or bring them down. But we think this empowerment is the key and most important long-lasting trend that is transformational and will stay with us forever. Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure, and I'd be happy to take some questions. And I made a lot of provocative statements because you're creative and smart, so I'm not the least bit offended if anyone says, that's really interesting, but I disagree. Or you can even say you're completely wrong, or yeah. It's not, oh, they just turned the lights on, so now I can see. Gentleman in the white shirt. I think they want to get a microphone to you, so let me just wait a moment. Well, I could hear you, so I'm happy to repeat the question if there's no microphone. I've talked a lot about this, but I'm happy to just talk about it here. But basically, we think the same thing will happen to Facebook, but with a couple of caveats. Nothing has ever gotten to 600 million people. Facebook is still growing. In places like Brazil, where 3 years ago Google's social network, Orkut, was a way of life, Orkut is now disappearing, and Facebook is coming in. So we think it will happen to Facebook, but I think Facebook is going to continue to grow for at least another 4 or 5 years, and we don't think it's going to be replaced by another monolithic community. We think it's going to fragment into more specialized communities. And just as many people still have their MySpace pages, just never go to them, we don't know that people will ever literally abandon Facebook, but we think it will be supplanted. We think it's the nature of teenagers to constantly be moving through communities. And once again, you said it is intergenerational, and it is, and that's one of the biggest liabilities as well. Yeah, actually, can everybody hear that? I didn't repeat it. Can you hear that in the back? He was just saying, go ahead. I'm sorry, I apologize. I said I was going to repeat it and I didn't.
Okay, I'm trying to remember exactly what I said, but...
No, I mean, just do the second part.
Yeah, so basically, it's a great way. Facebook is a great way for children to stay in touch with their grandparents, but they're probably going to spend most of their time on the next cool social, the next cool social network. Is that what you would say?
As I mentioned, I don't think they're necessarily ever going to abandon it. That's an interesting thought, that they'll use it to communicate with their extended families, with adults. I think that's entirely possible. But I think the hot community where they're really communicating with their friends isn't going to be one with 600-700 million people ultimately. And that's not a criticism of Facebook, just as it wasn't a criticism of MySpace and wasn't a Friendster. Although in retrospect, you can see some of the mistakes MySpace made. But even if they made no mistakes, we think it's a trend or a fad, but a pretty powerful one. Any other questions? Oh, hello.
Sorry, you said right at the beginning that there was a 2% drop-off.
Yes.
Of internet population.
Yes.
Where are those people?
We see worldwide, we see about 2% drop off the web each year. Interestingly, nobody drops off the web because they're unhappy with it. There are things people are unhappy with on the web, spyware, spam, viruses, but that's not why they leave. Well, the 2% are generally people who change jobs and lose their connection, whose PCs break and either they can't afford or they're not ready to replace it or fix it. And of those 2% who are off, with very few exceptions, they're back within 14 months, and many of them earlier than that. Having said that, as I said, very few people leave because of dissatisfaction, almost nobody. Many of us are dissatisfied. We're seeing this very powerful trend the last year, year and a half, where people look at all this technology, smartphones, all social networks, and they say, I don't want to live without it. This stuff is really important. I would never give it up, but I'm tired of it defining my life. I want to control it. A trend we've come to call enough already, E-NUFF. These are the people saying, this technology's made me, 75% of people think it's made them more productive at work. 5% think it's made them less productive, 20% said it's made them no different. But we know that we may be able to do in 30 hours what we used to do in 40 hours. But none of us are working 30 hours and calling it a week. We're now taking on more work than we've ever taken on before. We're working now on Saturday nights, Sunday mornings, New Year's Eve, Christmas Day. So there's a lot of frustration where people are looking at balance. But that's not the reason people are dropping off. The dropping off is physically losing their connection. Any other questions? I can't, because lots of bright lights.
Hi there.
You're moving up there.
No, turn the other way. There we go.
I'm
there
sorry.
We go.
There you are. OK.
Apart from being bought out, do you think Twitter business model is fundamentally flawed?
I'm sorry, I missed.
Apart from eventually maybe being bought, do you think Twitter's business model is fundamentally flawed?
I think we did in the US, Australia, the UK, Japan, we asked people their willingness to pay for Twitter. Now that's not always, it's not totally reliable because you're asking them to pay for something they already have for free, but there's almost no interest, zero interest in paying. The business model is clearly advertising. And you're seeing Twitter really scramble to find an advertising model that works, to build alliances. They're talking about Twitter now being valued at $10 billion. I do think there's a business model that works for Twitter, but I think it's exclusively advertising. On this issue of paying for content, I'm not a shill for the advertising business. I think there's only 3 ways to acquire content. You can steal it, and even those who steal it acknowledge it's not a very good business model. You can pay fees or subscriptions, or you can accept advertising. I think the majority of content, not all of it, but the majority is going to be supported by advertising. So I want to see digital advertising survive because I want to see content survive. And I think Twitter is a good example of that. We'll see where it works. And I'm also a big supporter of targeted advertising, the ability for advertisers to know who they're reaching, for you to be able to receive advertising that's more relevant. But I think your privacy and ability to opt out has to be completely protected. I'm told we have time for one more question. Is there? Well, I would call on you, but let's see if they get the microphone over to you.
I think I've got the mic.
Oh, I'm sorry. Then I'll talk now. I'll answer your question afterwards. I apologize. I can't. I'm sorry. Where's? Oh, okay. I see you now.
Yeah. The question was, old media or traditional media were permanent. The ABC, the BBC, CNN, Le Figaro, etc. You've mentioned that social media are more transitory, that we move from one social media brand to another. Do you think that transitory nature will extend to other platforms like Hulu? Will Hulu be a permanent platform, or will it become transitory like social media?
That's a really interesting question. Well, with the legacy media that you talked about, and so we don't think any of it disappears. We think it adapts and changes. I don't think Google's going to be a permanent platform. I think but I think Google is going to really be nimble, and I think you're going to see a lot of adjustment, and I think they're going to find a way to fit into this universe permanently. Their challenge, as I mentioned, is the challenge of getting into Facebook. And Google's also, I don't have to tell you anything about Google. A lot of people are smiling watching Google not squirm because they're not at that point, and they may never get at that point, but Google will be nervous. But I think they have an amazing ability to adapt. And with that, then thank you. It's always a pleasure to be in Australia. Thank you very, very much.